Joe Rogan's podcast has built its reputation on the idea of open conversation. Over the years, the Joe Rogan Experience has hosted everyone from scientists and comedians to politicians, athletes, and people with controversial or unusual life stories. That openness is part of why the show became one of the biggest media platforms in the world. But the same openness also creates a recurring problem. Occasionally, a guest later becomes connected to something deeply troubling. When that happens, it forces people to look back at the episode and ask uncomfortable questions about the ecosystem surrounding the show. That situation appears to be unfolding yet again with a recent case involving JRE guest Raul Bleki. According to records listed on the Maryland Judiciary Case Search System, Bleki has been charged in a criminal case in Maryland.
I firmly believe that what archaeologists currently say is the oldest culture, I believe it went the whole coast of Peru.
Wow.
I mean, this was a cradle of civilization. I mean, hands down.
Cradle of civilization 6,000 years ago.
6,000 years ago.
Anyone can verify the listing themselves through the Maryland Judiciary Case Search by entering the case number D06CR260000636. At the time of recording this video, there's been very little media coverage about the charges, which means the details are still emerging and the situation may change quickly as reporters begin to look into it. For that reason, it's important to approach the subject carefully and stick to what is publicly available rather than jump into conclusions. What can be said with certainty is that this is another moment where someone connected to the Rogan podcast is now appearing in connection with serious legal allegations. If this feels familiar, that's because something similar happened not too long ago with another Rogan guest, Sheldon Johnson.
I caught the gun charge that triggered the felony that it allowed them to be able to sentence me the way that they did in 1994. I also caught another case. At that time, I was what you call giving out consignment on drugs. Two people in particular, I gave consignment to, and I ended up getting arrested for a case.
Johnson's appearance on the podcast was widely discussed because of his life story. He spoke about his past, his time in prison, and his attempts at personal transformation. The episode presented him as someone who had gone through a brutal system and was trying to rebuild his life. For many listeners, it was a powerful conversation about redemption, but later developments surrounding Johnson complicated that narrative and sparked criticism about the types of figures who sometimes pass through the Rogan platform.
He is going on shows like the Joe Rogan podcast. Now tonight, he is back in handcuffs and he's facing murder charges. News 4's Ida Siegel is in Highbridge, where the crime scene investigators are still looking for evidence.
That's 48-year-old Sheldon Johnson being walked off in handcuffs, yelling to reporters that he didn't do what cops say he did. Murder, manslaughter, and criminal possession of a weapon. It's a shocking set of charges for a man most recently known for this.
I had a wife, I had family still, my son was growing up.
But police say this is also him, here on Summit Avenue Tuesday night, carrying cleaning supplies and a full black garbage bag in and out of this building. Police were called to apartment 6G after a neighbor heard gunshots and saw Johnson in and out of the apartment.
Taken together, these situations have created a pattern that people online have begun talking about more openly. Reddit threads, comment sections, and social media posts often ask the same question. Why do some of these strange or controversial characters end up on the Joe Rogan Experience in the first place? Rogan supporters usually respond with a straightforward answer. The podcast books guests from all kinds of backgrounds, and when you have thousands of hours of long-form interviews with such a wide range of people, it's statistically inevitable that some of these people will later get into trouble. Critics, however, argue that the show sometimes gravitates towards personalities who are already controversial or unstable, and that those personalities can become amplified by the enormous reach of the podcast. The truth is probably somewhere in between those two explanations. Rogan's show has always been built on curiosity rather than vetting. The conversations are often exploratory, and Rogan himself tends to approach guests with a sense of fascination rather than suspicion. That style has produced some incredibly compelling episodes over the years. But it also means that the show occasionally gives a platform to people whose stories later turn out to be more complicated than they first appeared. What makes the current moment interesting is that Rogan himself seems aware of the reputation forming around what people often call the Rogan sphere. Over the past couple of years, the surrounding comedy scene has become entangled in various controversies, from political arguments to feuds between comedians and media figures. Some of the personalities orbiting the Austin comedy scene have developed reputations for being chaotic, combative, or simply unpredictable. In that environment, every new controversy reinforces the perception that the Rogan universe attracts eccentric or unstable figures. But there are also signs that Rogan and the people around him understand that this reputation could eventually become a problem. If you look at what's happening with some of the projects connected to Rogan right now, there are hints of a subtle recalibration. One example is the changing tone of shows like Kill Tony, and I talked about this a little in my previous video. The program built its identity on brutal roast-style comedy and chaotic crowd interactions, which many fans loved because it felt raw and unpredictable. Yet in recent months, the show has slowly begun incorporating more musical performances and variety elements, giving it a slightly broader appeal.
Celebrities around every corner, and women that want you bad. Nothing but 9s and 10s, folks. Would you be interested in that? Well, welcome to Epstein's Island.
That shift may not seem huge on the surface, but it suggests that the people involved are thinking about longevity and expansion rather than simply leaning into controversy forever. From a business perspective, that makes sense. Rogan's platform is now enormous. His Spotify deal alone turned the podcast into one of the most influential pieces of media in the world. When you operate at that scale, the stakes become very different. Every guest, every headline, and every controversy gets magnified. Something that might once have been dismissed as internet drama can suddenly become a mainstream news story. That context is what makes the situation involving Raul Bleki worth discussing, even though the full details are still developing. Moments like this serve as reminders that the Rogan platform sits at a strange intersection of media, entertainment, and internet culture. It's not a traditional news program, and it's not simple comedy either. It's a freeform space where unusual personalities often appear and share their stories in front of millions of listeners. Sometimes those stories are inspiring, sometimes they are bizarre, and occasionally they lead to uncomfortable revelations later on. It's also important to avoid the temptation to treat Rogan himself as personally responsible for everything a guest does in their life. A podcast interview is not an endorsement of someone's future behavior. At the same time, large platforms inevitably shape public perception, and when controversial figures repeatedly appear within the same orbit, it becomes part of the narrative surrounding that platform. That tension is something Rogan has had to navigate more frequently as his influence has grown. For fans of the show, the challenge is balancing the curiosity that made the podcast successful with a realistic understanding of its limitations. Rogan's appeal has always been his willingness to talk to almost anyone. That openness created thousands of fascinating conversations over the years. But openness also means unpredictability, and unpredictability sometimes leads to situations like the one unfolding now. If the Rogan sphere truly is entering a new phase, then moments like this might reinforce the need for that evolution. As the Austin comedy scene expands and projects connected to Rogan continue to grow, maintaining credibility becomes more important than ever. That doesn't mean abandoning the raw, exploratory spirit that made the podcast popular. It simply means recognizing that a massive platform carries massive consequences. For now, the most responsible approach is patience. The legal process involving Raul Bleki will play out in the courts, and journalists will likely begin covering the case in more detail soon. Until then, the situation remains another example of how complicated the world around the Joe Rogan experience can be. It's a reminder that when you build a media universe around unpredictable personalities, you inevitably inherit some of their unpredictability as well. Whether the Rogosphere evolves or doubles down on its chaotic energy remains to be seen. But one thing is clear. As the platform continues to expand, the spotlight on everyone within that orbit will only grow brighter. And with that spotlight comes scrutiny that no podcast, no matter how influential, can completely escape.